Little MAGA girl cried after woke teacher took her police flag drawing, but WWII veteran walked in and left everyone in shock. Subscribe to the channel right now to find out the end of this epic story and comment below which part of this great America you are watching from. The morning of that Tuesday in Liberty Springs did not forecast storms. The sky, a clear and deep azure, stretched over the small American town like a mantle of tranquility, ignorant of the tensions simmering beneath the roof of the high school. The sun filtered through the white blinds of room 204, cutting the silent air with beams of light where dust motes danced slowly, suspended in time. For most students, it was just the start of another school day, a monotonous countdown to the lunch bell. But for Elena, a 14-year-old girl whose soul seemed forged in a simpler, nobler era, that morning silence was a sanctuary. Elena, known affectionately in her family circle and at the local church as the little MAGA girl, was a radiant anomaly in the grey corridors of modern education. While her classmates dressed in the sloppy uniformity of TikTok trends and walked hunched under the weight of teenage cynicism, Elena carried a rare dignity. Her hair consisted of golden curls that cascaded over her shoulders, shining like wheat fields in the sun, and around her neck hung a small silver cross, a gift from her grandmother which she never removed. She was the embodiment of the innocence the modern world seemed hell-bent on corrupting, a girl who still believed that a hand over one's heart during the national anthem was not an empty gesture, but a sacred oath of gratitude. That morning, Elena had arrived early to the art room. The environment was still empty, save for the low hum of the ventilation system. She had chosen a desk near the window, where the light was better, and where she felt a little more protected, away from the center of the room, which would soon become a stage for judgment. On the worn surface of the desk, Elena had arranged her materials with the care of a surgeon or a soldier cleaning his rifle. Perfectly sharpened colored pencils, a pristine white eraser, and in the center of it all, a sheet of heavyweight drawing paper. Her mission was clear and driven by love. It was National Police Appreciation Month, a time that, in Elena's home, was treated with the same reverence as federal holidays. Her Uncle Mike was a sergeant in the local police department. Elena grew up viewing Uncle Mike not as an agent of the state, but as the man who taught her to ride a bike, the gentle giant who cried at sad movies and who, every night, strapped on a bulletproof vest and kissed his wife and kids without knowing if he would come home. For Elena, the police represented the final barrier between the civilization she loved and the chaos she feared. With the tip of her tongue slightly protruding between her lips in an adorable sign of absolute concentration, she began to color. The drawing was simple but powerful, a stylized American flag in black and white, cut horizontally by a single, vibrant blue stripe. The thin blue line, the cobalt blue pencil glided over the paper, filling the white space with rich pigment. For Elena, that color wasn't just wax and pigment, it was a prayer. Every stroke was a silent thank you. Thank you for protecting my home. Thank you for patrolling the dark streets. Thank you for running toward danger when everyone else runs away. She remembered the stories her father told at Sunday dinner about honor, duty, and sacrifice. She knew that outside the safe bubble of her family, the world was getting colder, more hostile to these values. On TV and the internet, she saw people burning the flag she was now drawing with such affection. She saw mobs screaming hate at men like her uncle. It frightened her, making her little heart squeeze with an anxiety a 14-year-old shouldn't know. But there, hunched over her drawing, she felt she was doing her part. It was her small, silent resistance, her statement of love in a world addicted to hate. However, Liberty Springs High School was no longer the neutral haven of learning it had been decades ago. The walls, once decorated with historical maps and quotes from the Founding Fathers, now boasted colorful posters with ambiguous slogans about social justice and radical equity, terms Olena found confusing and often exclusionary for someone like her. The school's atmosphere had shifted subtly over the years, becoming an ideological minefield where a wrong word, a banned hat, or a dissenting opinion could result in immediate social isolation. Olena had learned to navigate this environment by staying silent, keeping her head down, and saving her patriotism for the sanctuary of her home. But today, the art would speak for her. The clock on the wall ticked, marking the approach of danger. Other students began to file in, dragging backpacks and loud conversations about digital influences and trivial drama. They passed Olena's desk without noticing the labor of love she was creating, blinded by the superficiality of their own digital bubbles. Olena, however, felt a shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. A chill ran down her spine, not from cold, but from premonition. The classroom door opened with an unnecessary bang, and Ms. Higgins entered. Ms. Higgins was the new art teacher, a recent hire that the school board, pressured by progressive guidelines, had celebrated as a breath of modernity. To Olena, she was the personification of fear. The woman didn't walk, she marched. Her heavy black combat boots, laced up to the shin, struck the linoleum with an aggressive, militaristic rhythm, but from an army fighting against its own country's history. Her hair was a visual manifesto, shaved on the sides and long on top, dyed a chaotic mix of neon pink and lime green, colors that seemed to scream for attention and defy any traditional notion of aesthetics. But what really made Olena's stomach turn wasn't the hair, but the look. Ms. Higgins's eyes, framed by thick red-rimmed glasses, swept the room like radars searching for dissent. She wasn't looking for artistic talent, she was looking for ideological conformity. On her navy blue blazer, which looked like a political commissar's uniform, she sported a collection of buttons and pins. Radical left slogans shone on her chest. Phrases against capitalism, symbols of movements preaching the dismantling of the nuclear family, and, most terrifying to Olena, a pin with a clenched fist that seemed to crush the word patriotism. Ms. Higgins dropped her bag onto the teacher's desk with a dull thud and turned to the class. The silence that followed wasn't one of respect, but of apprehension. Even the loudest students knew that in Ms. Higgins' class, art was secondary to indoctrination. She frequently steered the curriculum away from watercolor techniques and perspective to long, inflamed monologues about privilege, systemic oppression, and the toxicity of Western values. She saw the classroom not as a place of teaching, but as a battlefield to mold young minds in her own image. "Good morning, class," said Ms. Higgins, her voice dripping with a fake sweetness that barely hid the disdain she felt for the flyover country town where she was forced to teach. "Today we will continue our discussion on art as a tool for social deconstruction. I want to see work that challenges the status quo. I want to see revolt." Olena shrank slightly in her chair. Deconstruction. Revolt. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. She looked at her drawing, the American flag, the blue line. That wasn't revolt. It was order. It was respect. It was love. In a moment of panic, she realized her work was the exact antithesis of what the teacher demanded. She considered flipping the sheet, hiding the drawing, pretending she was doing some random abstract sketch. But then, the image of Uncle Mike came to her mind. His smile when he wore his uniform. His courage. "No," thought Olena, straightening her back. "I won't be ashamed. It's not wrong to love those who protect us." Ms. Higgins began her rounds. She walked between the rows of desks, her boots squeaking, criticizing or praising work based on purely political criteria. A student who had drawn a tree was ignored. Another student who had made a collage with fashion magazine cutouts received a disinterested nod. But as the teacher approached the back of the room, near the window, fate seemed to close in like a trap. Elena gripped the blue pencil so hard her knuckles turned white. She could hear the teacher's breathing getting closer. The smell of cheap perfume mixed with the acrid scent of permanent markers invaded Elena's personal space. Miss Higgins' shadow cast over the desk, blocking the sunlight, covering the thin blue line. The temperature around Elena plummeted. The world reduced to that small rectangle of paper and the imposing figure now standing motionless beside her. The little MAGA girl was alone, vulnerable. A tiny island of tradition about to be hit by a tsunami of ideological fury. She looked up, trembling, trying to force an innocent smile, the smile of a girl who just wanted to show her art. But she didn't find a smile back. She found the abyss. Miss Higgins' eyes locked onto the drawing, the teacher's pupils contracted, her chin lifted in an angle of supreme arrogance. The air in the room became electric, heavy, suffocating. The morning calm was gone. The exposure was complete, and the storm was about to break over the young patriot's head. Elena felt her heart beating in her throat, a caged bird desperate to escape, while the teacher inhaled deeply, filling her lungs not with air, but with judgment and condemnation. The atmosphere in the classroom froze instantly, as if time itself had stopped before the imminence of psychological violence. Ms. Higgins hovered over Elena's desk like a bird of prey, spotting helpless game, her shadow casting long and dark over the American flag drawing. The hum of the ventilation seemed to vanish, replaced by the accelerated sound of the teacher's breathing, becoming heavier and louder, a bellows fueling the fire of her manufactured indignation. "What is that on your desk, Elena?" Ms. Higgins' voice wasn't a pedagogical question. It was a pre-verdict. The tone dripped acidic venom, a mixture of academic condescension and activist fury. The question echoed off the classroom walls, causing other students to immediately stop their side conversations. Heads turned, curious and fearful eyes focused on the scene. The court was in session, and Elena, unknowingly, was already in the defendant's seat. Elena felt a knot tighten in her throat, a physical sensation of suffocation caused by pure fear. Her hands trembled slightly over the paper, instinctively trying to shield the work. She raised her blue eyes, moist with apprehension, searching for any trace of humanity in the teacher's face, but found only a mask twisted with ideological contempt. It's for my uncle, ma'am." Elena's voice came out as a shaky whisper, failing in the attempt to maintain composure. She swallowed hard, trying to summon the courage she saw in her father, the faith she learned at church. "It's the thin blue line flag. I'm finishing it for Police Appreciation Month, to support the police." The mention of the word police acted like a detonator in Ms. Higgins' indoctrinated mind. Her eyes narrowed behind the red lenses, and the vein in her neck pulsed visibly. To her, educated in the hermetic bubbles of university radicalism and fed by social media echo chambers, that wasn't a child's drawing. It wasn't a gesture of love from a niece to an uncle. It was a personal affront. It was the visual manifestation of everything she had been programmed to hate and destroy. The flag, with its solitary blue stripe, didn't represent order to her. It represented the enemy. Miss Higgins's face contorted into a grimace of repulsion, as if she were facing something physically rotting. "Support the police?" she repeated, her voice rising an octave, loaded with incredulity and scorn. Without any warning, without asking permission, violating the personal space and dignity of the student, the teacher reached out with the speed of a snake. Her fingers, adorned with thick silver rings, dug into the edge of the drawing paper. With a violent and disrespectful yank, she snatched the drawing from under Elena's hands. The girl shrank into her chair. a reflex movement of someone expecting a physical blow, her colored pencils rolling to the floor from the impact of the aggressive gesture. Miss Higgins spun on the heels of her military boots, raising the drawing above her head as if displaying evidence of a heinous crime to the jury. "Attention, class!" she bellowed, her shrill voice filling every cubic inch of the room, transforming the educational environment into a forced political rally. "Look at this. This right here is not art. This is hate propaganda. This is a symbol of white supremacist intolerance that has no place, absolutely no place, in my inclusive classroom." The shock hit Olena like a cold wave. Hot tears, which she fought to hold back, overflowed, rolling down her flushed cheeks. Her heart beat so hard it hurt against her ribs. She looked around, desperate for support, but saw only faces averting their gaze. Her classmates, many of whom played with her at recess, were now paralyzed by the fear of being the next target of the teacher's fury. The fear of cancellation, even at that age, had already been instilled in them. No one dared to move. Olena was alone on the desert island of her convictions. "Ma'am!" Olena tried to argue, her voice choked with crying. A MAGA girl trying to defend her truth against a giant of leftist rhetoric. She rose slightly from her chair, reaching out for her captured drawing. "It's just a flag. They protect us. My uncle is a hero." "Silence!" Miss Higgins roared, spinning back to Olena with a ferocity that made the girl fall back into her seat. The shout was so loud it echoed in the hallway outside. "You have no right to spread this fascist rhetoric here. Do you not understand the trauma this image causes? The police are the armed wing of state oppression. They are agents of the patriarchy and systemic racism. We do not celebrate oppressors in this school. We deconstruct them." The teacher was now in a state of performative ecstasy, feeding off her own signaled virtue. She looked at Olena not as a child, but as an extension of the political system she despised. Olena was, in that moment, the symbol of everything the radical left wanted to eradicate: tradition, order, guilt-free patriotism. The humiliation escalated to an unthinkable level of cruelty. Before Olena's terrified eyes and the complicit silence of the class, Ms. Higgins held the drawing with both hands. The heavyweight paper, chosen with such care by Olena, resisted for a brief second before yielding to the brute force of hate. "Ripe." The sound of the paper tearing was loud, crisp, and devastating. It sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the room. Olena brought her hands to her mouth, stifling a sob, her eyes wide with disbelief. She saw the blue stripe, which she had colored with such love, being split in half. The barrier between order and chaos was destroyed by the hands of the one who was supposed to educate. But Ms. Higgins didn't stop there. Overcome by a destructive fury, she continued to tear the drawing. Rip, rip, piece by piece. The American flag was dismembered, turned into irregular confetti of paper. With a final gesture of supreme contempt, the teacher threw the remains of the drawing onto Olena's desk, letting them fall over the girl like toxic rain. "This is what we do with symbols of hate," declared Ms. Higgins, panting, her chest rising and falling with the adrenaline of the moment. She felt victorious, a social justice warrior who had just defeated a great evil, completely ignoring that her victory was over a 14-year-old girl who was now sobbing uncontrollably. "Your parents should be ashamed to teach this kind of blind worship of authority inside the home. This is the problem with Trump's America, this outdated and dangerous obsession with an order that only serves to oppress minorities. As long as I am a teacher here, this ideology will not pass." Olena was devastated. The world around her seemed to have crumbled. She looked at the pieces of paper scattered on her desk and in her lap. The work of hours, the tribute to her uncle, the expression of her patriotic soul, all destroyed in seconds by pure intolerance. Her crying was the only sound in the room now, a raw and painful sound of broken innocence. She felt small, infinitesimal. The weight of the school institution, the teacher's authority, the culture that seemed to applaud this type of behavior, all of it fell on her youthful shoulders. Olena felt there was no place for her in that world. If loving her country and respecting the law was a crime punishable by such a penalty, then she was a criminal in their eyes. The sense of isolation was absolute. Ms. Higgins, with her neon hair and protest buttons, stood there erect, triumphant, a statue of modern tyranny, watching over the emotional wreckage she had just caused. Olena's despair hit rock bottom. She buried her face in her hands, her golden curls trembling with every sob, wishing to disappear, wishing someone, anyone, could see the injustice of it. But the door was closed. The room was an ideological prison. The leftist had won, crushing the spirit of the little MAGA girl under the boot of a false morality. Darkness seemed to have swallowed the last light of that Tuesday morning. There was no visible hope, only the sound of a child's weeping and the victorious breathing of her tormentor. Olena's humiliation seemed endless. Ms. Higgins, not satisfied with merely destroying the physical work, now wished to destroy the girl's spirit, using that moment as an exemplary lesson for the rest of the class on the dangers of conservative thought. The teacher paced back and forth at the front of the room, gesturing with hands stained with graphite and ink, while the pieces of the thin blue line lay like paper corpses on the student's desk. "And don't think this ends here," hissed Ms. Higgins, pointing an accusing finger at Olena, who sobbed with her face hidden in her arms. "I am forwarding a disciplinary report to the administration. You will write a 5-page essay on police brutality and systemic privilege as an apology to the class for bringing symbols of hate into this safe space. You will learn, Olena, one way or another, that your worldview is obsolete." The class remained in terrified silence. The air was stale, heavy with the teacher's arrogance and the student's pain. The radical left seemed to have consolidated its victory, turning the classroom into a forced re-education camp. Olena felt herself sinking into a dark abyss where her voice had no value and her heroes were villains. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying silently for the bell to ring so she could flee. It was in that exact instant of absolute despair, when ideological tyranny seemed invincible, that the atmosphere in the hallway changed. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't an alarm. It was a rhythmic, heavy, unmistakable sound that started low and grew, cutting through the hum of the ventilation and reaching the ears of everyone in the room. Thump, step, thump, step. It was the sound of hard wood striking against the linoleum floor, followed by the firm but decided drag of a military boot. The rhythm was slow, but it carried a geological determination, like the advance of a glacier or the movement of tides. Something ancient and powerful was approaching. Ms. Higgins stopped in the middle of a sentence about microaggressions. Frowning, annoyed by the auditory interruption, she looked at the open door, ready to scold whoever was making noise in the hallway. The light from the corridor was suddenly blocked. A silhouette formed in the doorframe, filling the space with a presence that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the teacher's arrogance. Then he entered. It wasn't the principal in his cheap suit, nor another professor carrying books on critical theory. It was a living monument of American history. Sergeant Major Thomas Miller stopped just past the threshold. At 96 years old, his posture defied biology. His back was straight, tempered by decades of discipline. He wore his full World War II dress uniform, the olive-drab fabric impeccably pressed, every crease sharp as a razor. On his chest, a constellation of metal and ribbon told the story of the 20th century. The Silver Star, the Purple Heart, the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with bronze arrowheads. They tinkled softly with his breathing, a sound that commanded immediate respect. He held a dark wooden cane in his right hand, his thick, weather-beaten knuckles gripping the handle with vigor. His hair was snow-white, cut close in military style, and his face was a map of deep wrinkles, every line telling a story of survival, loss, and glory. But it was his eyes that captured the soul of anyone who saw him. They were steely blue eyes, cold and piercing, eyes that had seen the beaches of Normandy dyed red and the brutal winters of the Ardennes. They were eyes that didn't blink in the face of fear. Sergeant Miller was at the school that day to be the guest of honor for a small Veterans Day talk organized by the history teacher, an event Ms. Higgins had tried unsuccessfully to cancel at the last staff meeting, deeming it glorification of militarism. While passing through the hallway on his way to the auditorium, the old soldier heard the shouting. He recognized the tone. It wasn't the tone of teaching. It was the tone of a tyrannical officer abusing recruits. And then he heard the crying of a child. The silence that fell over room 204 was absolute, almost sacred. The mere physical presence of the veteran, charged with the aura of one who has faced true evil, made the woke atmosphere of the room evaporate. "What is happening here?" Sergeant Miller's voice was gravelly, deep, coming from the bottom of his chest. It wasn't a shout, but it resonated off the walls with more authority than any hysterical yell from the teacher. It was a voice of command, used to being heard over the roar of mortars and machine guns. Miss Higgins, caught completely off guard, instinctively took a step back. Faced with that figure of traditional masculinity and historical authority, her aggressive posture faltered. She blinked, trying to process the intrusion of that relic into her progressive domain. "Excuse me." The teacher tried to regain control, straightening her blazer and lifting her chin, though her hands trembled slightly. "Sir, you cannot enter here like this. This is a private classroom during school hours. I'm educating this student. Who are you?" The old soldier didn't answer immediately. He began to walk slowly toward the front of the room. Thump, step, thump, step. Every strike of the cane was a judgment. He ignored the teacher as if she were an irrelevant obstacle on the battlefield and focused his attention on the scene of the moral crime. His eyes swept Olena's desk, landing on the torn pieces of the flag and finally on the tear-bathed face of the girl. Upon seeing the old man, Olena felt something shift inside her. The paralyzing fear gave way to a feeling of awe. She recognized that uniform from family albums and the movies she watched with her dad. She knew what that man represented. Sergeant Miller stopped in front of Olena's desk. He looked at the confetti of paper-colored blue, red, and white. His expression hardened, his jaw locking with a force that made the muscles in his face twitch. He then turned slowly to Ms. Higgins. The difference between the two was abysmal. On one side, the ephemeral and colorful fury of radical modernity. On the other, the eternal rock of founding values. "Educating," repeated Sergeant Miller, the word coming out with cold disdain. He pointed with the tip of his cane to the wreckage of the drawing. "Ripping up a child's work is education now. Humiliating a girl until she cries is the new curriculum." Miss Higgins felt her face burn. She wasn't used to being challenged, much less by someone who represented everything she had been taught to despise. "I am deconstructing symbols of hate," she fired back, trying to use her academic vocabulary as a shield. "That flag, that thin blue line drawing is fascist propaganda. It represents police oppression. I will not allow that nationalist rhetoric to poison my inclusive classroom. I have a duty to protect minorities from this visual aggression." The veteran let out a short, dry laugh, devoid of any humor. He took a step toward the teacher, who retreated again, intimidated by the man's imposing nature. "Hate? Fascism?" Sergeant Miller shook his head, incredulous. "You use those words, ma'am, but you don't know the weight they carry. I do. I saw the face of true fascism. I smelled it in the concentration camps we liberated and in the trenches where my friends died. He raised a gloved hand and touched the medals on his chest. I fought on beaches where the sand turned red with the blood of good men. 18-year-old boys who never had the chance to grow up, never had the chance to dye their hair or complain on the internet. We fought against tyrants who burned books and banned ideas. We fought so you could have the freedom to stand here, dressed however you like, saying whatever you think, no matter how foolish it is. His voice began to rise, vibrating with a patriotic energy that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the school. The students were mesmerized. No one looked at a cell phone. History was alive in front of them. But I didn't walk through hell, and my brothers didn't die in freezing mud so that you could use that blood-bought freedom to terrorize a 14-year-old girl. The sergeant's finger pointed at the teacher's face like a bayonet. You speak of oppression while acting like an oppressor. You speak of tolerance while tolerating nothing that diverges from your playbook. That flag and the blue line this young lady drew represent the barrier between civilization and barbarism. When you tear that up, you aren't attacking a politician. You are spitting in the face of every man and woman who puts on a badge or a uniform to ensure you can sleep safe at night and come here to play revolutionary. Ms. Higgins opened her mouth to retort, ready to hurl accusations of toxic masculinity and white patriarchy, but the words died in her throat. The veteran's moral authority was crushing. He wasn't debating. He was stating fundamental facts of existence. She felt small, a petulant child being scolded by an adult. Desperate, she tried the last card of the cornered bureaucrat. I demand that you leave right now. This is harassment. I'm calling security. You are violating the school code of conduct. I will have you banned from this campus. Don't bother, said Sergeant Miller, his calm contrasting violently with her hysteria. I'm going to the principal's office myself as soon as I leave here. And I'm sure the school board and the parents of this community, many of whom are police officers, firefighters, and veterans, will be very interested to know why a teacher paid with public tax dollars is destroying students' private property and practicing psychological terrorism for political reasons. Ms. Higgins's threat crumbled. She knew that outside her academic bubble, the community of Liberty Springs would not tolerate this. She retreated to her desk, morally defeated, but still casting glares of hate, silently promising revenge through administrative channels. You will regret this, she muttered, but her voice had no strength. Sergeant Miller turned his back on her, discarding her like a neutralized threat. All the hardness of the warrior vanished instantly when he looked down at Elena. He approached the desk, leaning on his cane and bending one knee with difficulty, getting to eye level with the girl. His wrinkled face softened into a gentle grandfatherly expression. He pulled an impeccable white linen handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. Dry your eyes, soldier, he said softly. Elena took the handkerchief, her hands trembling less now. She wiped her face. Looking into the sergeant's blue eyes, she saw kindness there and a strength she desperately needed. I'm sorry, sir, she whispered, her voice cracking. She tore it. I just wanted... I know what you wanted, young lady. The sergeant interrupted gently. Don't apologize for loving your country. Don't apologize for honoring the brave. Tears don't fix flags, but courage does. You have a right to be here. Never let anyone, no matter how loud they scream, how many degrees they have, or how colorful their hair is, tell you that loving America is wrong. With a slow and solemn movement, Sergeant Miller brought his hand to the upper pocket of his uniform. He removed a small metallic object. It was an old brooch, a lapel pin featuring the American flag intertwined with the insignia of his old infantry unit. The metal was worn by time, but shone with dignity. He placed the pin delicately on the table next to the pieces of torn paper. The contrast was powerful. The paper destroyed by the teacher's momentary hate and the enduring metal of the veteran's patriotic love. "Keep this," he said. "It's a real symbol, something that doesn't tear so easily. I carried it when I came home in 1945. It reminded me who I was when the world tried to change me. Let it remind you who you are now." Olena touched the pin with her fingertips, feeling the cold of the metal and the warmth of the gesture. A wave of pride ran through her body, filling the void left by the humiliation. She raised her head, straightening her posture. "Thank you, sir," she said, and for the first time that morning her voice was steady. Sergeant Miller stood up, groaning slightly with the effort, and placed his hand on her shoulder. A light touch, but one that seemed to transfer a heritage of strength. He then turned to the class, who watched everything in reverent silence. "Remember this day," he said to the students, his voice echoing. "Freedom isn't free, and it is fragile. If you don't defend it here, in this room, you will lose it out there." He looked one last time at Miss Higgins, who was sitting at her desk, pretending to type something on the computer, refusing to face defeat. The climate of institutional tension still hovered. The battle in the classroom had been won, but the culture war was far from over. The veteran adjusted the cap on his head, tapped his cane on the floor, and began his march out of the room, leaving behind a transformed girl and an unmasked teacher. The door to room 204 closed behind Sergeant Major Miller, but the energy he brought remained vibrating in the air, dense and transformative. For a long moment, the only audible sound was the mechanical hum of the clock on the wall and Miss Higgins' ragged breathing, staying static behind her desk, her face burning in a volatile mix of humiliation and disbelief. She, the unquestionable authority, the guardian of progressive truth, had been dismantled not by shouts or digital cancellation, but by the simple and irrefutable presence of honor. Olena looked at the pin in her hand. The cold metal warmed against her palm. She looked at the pieces of her torn flag and, instead of pain, felt a determination of steel harden in her chest. She was no longer the scared girl from 10 minutes ago. She had been anointed by a hero. At the back of the room, a timid sound broke the silence. Clap, then another. Clap, clap. It was Jason, the football team captain, a boy who usually followed the current to avoid trouble, but he was standing now looking at Olena with respect. Then it was Emily, the quiet girl in the front row. Then Mike, Sam, and Jessica. In seconds, the entire room was standing. A wave of spontaneous applause swept the environment, growing in volume and intensity. They weren't applauding the destruction of the drawing. They were applauding the resistance. They were applauding Sergeant Miller and, more importantly, applauding Olena. The little MAGA girl had become, unwittingly, the symbol of something they all felt but were afraid to express, the exhaustion of being indoctrinated, the desire to love their country without guilt. Mrs. Higgins looked at her students as if they were strangers. The narrative she had tried to build with such care, that Olena was the villain and she the savior, had blown up in her face. Sit down now!" She tried to yell, banging on the desk, but her voice held no more power. Moral authority had changed hands. She was just a woman with colored hair, screaming against the tide of truth. The bell rang shrilly, saving her from complete mutiny, and the students exited the room, many passing by Olena's desk to pat her shoulder or whisper, "A good job." But the real storm was just beginning outside the school walls. Sergeant Miller kept his promise. He didn't just go to the principal, he called in the cavalry. When news of the incident spread, that a teacher had ripped up an American flag and made a student cry for supporting the police, the town of Liberty Springs woke up. The sleeping giant, the silent majority of working parents, veterans, mothers, and patriotic citizens rose with righteous fury. That same night, the school board meeting, usually attended by half a dozen bored people, was packed. The parking lot overflowed with pickup trucks with American flags waving in the beds. The auditorium was standing room only, a sea of people demanding answers. In the front row, seated with the dignity of a king, was Sergeant Miller, still in uniform. Beside him, holding his hand firmly, was Olena, and beside Olena, her parents and Uncle Mike in uniform, along with dozens of other off-duty police officers who came to show solidarity. Miss Higgins tried to defend herself. She took the podium, using words like academic freedom, social context, and necessary discomfort. She tried to paint herself as the victim of a conservative witch hunt, but her words rang hollow, artificial, disconnected from the reality of that community. When it was Olena's turn to speak, the silence was absolute. She didn't need a prepared speech. She just held the pin the veteran had given her and spoke from the heart. "I drew the blue line because my uncle leaves the house every night to protect people he doesn't even know," said Olena, her clear and steady voice echoing in the microphones. Ms. Higgins said this is hate. But Sergeant Miller taught me that hate is destroying what others love. I love my country, I love my family, and I don't think school should be a place where we are scared to say that. The auditorium exploded. There was no real debate after that. The pressure was unsustainable. The school board, confronted with the clear violation of conduct policies, destruction of student property, bullying, and ideological discrimination, had to act. Institutional justice, often slow, was accelerated by the light of public truth. The resolution was read by the board president, a man who looked visibly relieved to be able to do the right thing. Ms. Higgins was placed on immediate administrative leave, pending an investigation everyone knew would end in her termination. The attempt to cancel Olena's innocence resulted in the cancellation of the teacher's tyranny. When the meeting ended, Olena was surrounded, not as a victim, but as a local heroine. People shook her hand, thanked her for her courage. Uncle Mike lifted her in a bear hug with tears in his eyes. "You're braver than me, kid," he whispered. But the most important moment happened in the parking lot under the starry sky of America. Sergeant Miller was waiting near his vintage car. Olena walked up to him. "We did it, Sergeant," she said, smiling. The old warrior shook his head. "You did it, Olena. I just provided cover. The infantry was all you." He looked at the sky, breathing the fresh night air, the air of freedom. "You know, I wondered if it was worth it, if the country I fought for still existed. Today, seeing you in there, seeing all these parents, I know it does. America doesn't die as long as there are children willing to hold the flag when the adults drop it." "I'm going to draw another one," promised Olena. "Bigger, and I'll hang it in my locker." "Do that," said the sergeant, saluting the girl, a gesture of respect between soldiers. "And if anyone tries to tear it down, you know where to find me." The following week at Liberty Springs High School was different. The oppressive atmosphere had dissipated like fog in the sun. A new art teacher was hired, a man who taught perspective and shading, not activism. But the biggest change was in the students. They walked with their heads held higher. Hats with flags began to appear. T-shirts with patriotic messages came out of the bottom of drawers. Fear had vanished, replaced by a healthy pride. Olena sat at her desk that Friday. The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating her new masterpiece. It was a glorious, vibrant American flag, taking up the whole paper. The blue line shone in the center, strong and unbreakable. In the corner of the sheet, she drew a small medal, a replica of Sergeant Miller's pin. She signed her name with pride, Olena, the Patriot. The lesson of that fateful Tuesday would remain engraved forever in her soul. She learned that evil triumphs only when good people stay silent. She learned that tradition, honor, and faith are not ashes of the past, but the fire that lights the future. The little MAGA girl had grown. She was no longer just a girl who drew, she was a guardian of the flame. Freedom won, innocence was preserved, and the flag, with all its stars and stripes, remained there, waving proudly, protected by old soldiers and young girls who dared to believe that America was still, and would always be, the greatest hope on earth.